Today's discussion is an opportunity to explore both of these facets with respect to an urgent challenge, the conflict in Syria and the recent events there following the U.S. withdrawal. We'll be hearing from a mix of policymakers, legal scholars, and journalists. I also want to take a moment to recognize our center's namesake, Rick Reese, who's here with us. Rick, thank you, as always, for your leadership and support. And now I'm delighted to turn things over to Ryan Goodman. He is the Anne and Joel Ehrenkrantz Professor of Law here at the Law School, a faculty director at the Reese Center, and the founding co-editor-in-chief of the online forum Just Security. He'll be introducing our panelists and moderating their conversation today. And before I turn things over, please join me in thanking him and our esteemed speakers.
So thank you for being with us, and I'm looking forward to the conversation because couldn't imagine a greater group of experts to talk to us about the crisis in Syria and recent events. In some ways, I was thinking to say marked by the fact that we're holding this on Halloween, but I actually don't mean to make a joke about it in a sense because it is so harrowing. And we'll also have time for, I'm going to moderate the panel and ask the questions that are in some ways, I think, on everybody's minds and my mind, but there'll also be time for questions from you all in the audience as well. And just to say just a few words of introduction about our speakers, but I think they're well known to you and that's why you're here. But I'm going to introduce them alphabetically, and it also kind of ties together some of their biographical backgrounds in a certain sense. So first is Anne Barnard, who led coverage of the Syrian war for 6 years at the New York Times, reporting from across the Middle East as the Beirut bureau chief. She also previously served as the bureau chief for the Boston Globe in Baghdad. And I noticed, Anne, in your own bio, you describe covering the U.S. invasion and occupation at that time. And John Feiner, who's a non-resident advisor here at the Reese Center on Law and Security at NYU, served as Chief of Staff and Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department and as Secretary John Kerry's principal advisor. Before that, in the first term of the Obama administration, he served in the White House as the Middle East advisor to Vice President Biden. And then the biographical note is that in John's bio, he was also a correspondent at the Washington Post and mentions in his own bio that that includes covering the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So, not just that they have that expertise, but that's a formative part of who they are and what they know and how they understand these global politics. So, and then the third is Klaus Kress. Klaus is a professor of international law and criminal law. He holds the chair for the German and international criminal law, and he is the director of the Institute of International Peace and Security Law at the University of Cologne. And then a biographical note for Klaus is that he also served in government. His prior practice was in the German Federal Ministry of Justice and Matters of Criminal Law and International Law, and has served as a member of Germany's delegations to the negotiations on the International Criminal Court. So when Rachel said that we have like a mix of reporters and policymakers and scholars, that's actually a mix inside each of these individuals as well as across each of these individuals. And Klaus has been at the forefront of writing and thinking about use of force issues. He's one of the most esteemed public international law experts. So that's partly why I will be not saying much about public international law, but we'll turn it over to Klaus for his comments. So I thought what we'd first do is just try to set the stage, some of the facts on the ground. And when Rachel and I talked about convening the panel, that was about a couple weeks ago. So major developments have happened since. And John or Anne, if you want to kind of start us out with, where are we? When we convened the panel, the panel was under the idea of U.S. withdrawal. And now the question is it U.S. withdrawal but like a half a foot back in? And then obviously one of the more recent profound events is the operation against al-Baghdadi and what that means for the kind of facts on the ground, and then we can start to get into some of the other kind of policy implications. So kind of where are we? What are the most recent developments that you think kind of explain how to think about U.S. policy and what is U.S. policy right now toward Syrian IS?
Well, so I don't know how far back I should go in setting the stage. I guess just I will briefly talk about the situation, the status quo ante, which is that the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was the partner force with the United States in fighting ISIS, at least on the Syrian side, controlled almost a third of Syria, including Arab majority areas like Raqqa, part of Deir ez-Zor, and also Kurdish majority areas near the border with Turkey. And after the defeat of ISIS as a territorial entity, there was this sort of ethical, legal, strategic conundrum about what to do next. That had sort of always been there, looming at the end of the ISIS operation. How long would the United States stay to help this partner force continue to rule a part of Syria where, unlike other parts, the population was not faced with either jihadist group like ISIS or the bombing and repression by the Assad government and their Russian allies. There was some incoherence to the policy in the first place, and then when the Trump administration came in, they added to that by also establishing maximalist goals for what this presence would do to deter Iran, and they had a set of goals that was sort of out of proportion to what that force could actually do in the long run, and was out of proportion to the U.S. long-term commitment, especially since, as John and I were saying in the other room, Trump had made pretty clear from the beginning that his inclination was to get out. And there have been several backs and forths, which we won't bore you with the details, but several backs and forths already in which he said they were getting out, and then the Pentagon seemed to sort of slow roll that and not really do it. And so anyway, enter into this sort of fragile situation, Trump throwing something of a grenade into it by suddenly agreeing with Erdogan that they would move back the forces that were on the border, so that the Turks would come in and take over at least a strip along the border, which they said was necessary for their national security, because this partner force of the United States is also affiliated with the PKK, which is a group that Turkey has been fighting an on and off insurgency war with for decades. So all of a sudden, we've completely seen the map of Syria rewritten, at least in the northeast portion, by the Turkish invasion, which has displaced some 200,000 people in an area that had really been one of the safest and most stable for civilians, at least over the past year or so. We have seen the SDF leadership switch sides and say that now they will ally with the Assad government in order to protect themselves from the Turks. There are a lot of questions about what that really means, how far the regime forces will go in returning to that entire area, whether they will even be effective. I think I think it was yesterday there was the Turks were actually taking back territory that was supposed to have been handed over to the Syrian government to prevent further fighting there. So we don't even know if they'll be able to provide the protection that they offered, and at what price would that protection come. So, and then just to make things more confusing, Trump, after having said that one of the main reasons that he acceded to Erdogan's desire to make this incursion into Syria was to get the U.S. forces out, now he says that almost an equal number are coming in, and it's actually happening now, to, he says, protect the oil, which is a relatively small amount of oil in terms of global standards, but is critical in that it had been used in the past by ISIS, and certainly the Syrian government would like to get their hands back on it. So now, what is the policy? Are we in or out? I even have questions about, tactically, the supply lines, now that the Americans and their allies don't control one of the main routes that they used to use. So many more questions than answers, actually, about what the policy is, and even how much more the situation on the ground is likely to change in the coming weeks.
I guess I'd just add, I think there have been like 5 key turning points in the trajectory of what's happened in northeast Syria that I think I can go through relatively quickly. It's easy to forget now, but 2011, when the conflict in Syria broke out, to roughly 2014, northeast Syria was not a part of the country that you heard a lot about. There was not a lot of fighting there relative to other places. It was quiet. It was only in 2014 with the real emergence of ISIS, which went on to take a third of the territory, roughly, of Iraq and Syria combined, that people started to worry about the implications of the ISIS caliphate on people who were, let's just say, not aligned with their worldview. And then the focus of the conflict for the U.S. began to shift to those ISIS-held regions in northeast Syria. So it's 2014 is a real turning point where this region, which we had not really paid a lot of attention to, nor had the rest of the world, becomes the area of focus. The U.S. then makes a decision in 2014, the Obama administration in which I served, that we basically had two choices. One, to deal with ISIS would be to go in with tens of thousands of American forces and try to fight ISIS in a roughly analogous way to the way we conducted the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. The other was to find a local partner. And after looking around, and I'm sure this will come up more later in the discussion, I won't go into all the details of it, the only viable local partner that our administration decided could actually fight against ISIS was this loose coalition of groups that became known as the SDF and was led in many ways by Syrian Kurds. Fast forward to 2017, the fight against ISIS is one of the few, relatively speaking, successful aspects of the American experience in Syria. I'm not going to come here and tell you we got many things right, but that piece of the conflict, at least according to the standards that we set, was going relatively well. The Trump administration comes in, does a strategic review, and decides to essentially continue that approach, working with the SDF led by Kurds to fight ISIS. 2018, President Trump tweets that he wants to take all of American troops out of both Syria and Afghanistan, end of 2018. This is something he had signaled well before that, but sort of set the clock on this region, a countdown, if you will, toward having to resolve this fundamental contradiction. The U.S. working with a partner that the Turks, an American NATO ally, considered its preeminent security threat. Negotiations take place throughout the end of 2018 and through 2019 to try to come up with a diplomatic way to address that highly contested piece of the conflict. 2019, President Trump pulls the plug in the midst of those negotiations. Depending on who you talk to, they had come up with a relatively, at least for the near term, sustainable way to address that without a major Turkish offensive, but the president in his call with President Erdogan decides otherwise, and the Turks invade. And as Ann said, we're now in this very strange situation where not only are the troops not out, there are some going back in, and then there's a whole piece of the Syria mission which is actually not related to ISIS and not related to Assad, but about, as the administration has described it, countering Iran inside Syria that is continuing unabated. There's a base in more or less roughly central Syria called Al-Tanf, which is ostensibly geared towards stopping the infiltration of advanced weapons from Iran through Iraq to Syria, and those troops have not been even discussed in the context of a withdrawal. So the U.S. policy is pretty hard to discern. Getting good facts from people like Ann, who have spent time on the ground there and are continuing to, is even harder now than it's been in the past because of all the instability, harder to get in and harder to get out. And we're all trying to sort through it.
Great, thanks. So I thought to turn to Klaus to get like one of the first international legal questions on the table, which is the legality of the Turks' operation. So Operation Peace Spring, I guess, is the term for it. And what has happened in the past few weeks since the phone call with President Trump and then Erdogan going in. And to make it a little bit more concrete, Turkey does send a letter to the UN Security Council providing a justification, legal justification for their position, and they say part of it is that the Syrian Kurd forces have facilitated, quote, smuggling explosive devices, weapons, and ammunition into Turkey with the aim of empowering PKK-affiliated units inside Turkish territories to commit deadly terrorist attacks against innocent Turkish citizens, end quote. And so the question is, and then maybe John and Ann can talk about whether or not that's factually accurate and the like, but would that be a legal basis? So the Syrian Kurd forces inside Syria helping facilitate the transmission of arms and personnel into Turkey with the PKK, which is the terrorist organization labeled as such by both Turkey and the United States. So if I'm thinking of what is the strongest, most charitable, strongest argument on their side, that seems to be it. So what do you think about that legal argument? And then just to put a sharper point on it, doesn't that sound like the U.S. argument under international law for the ability to use force in another state's territory if the threat from terrorist groups comes at the United States? In fact, it sounds a little bit like the U.S. position for use of force against both al-Qaeda and ISIS inside Syria because of the threat against Iraq and the United States.
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, it is probably the closest argument that one could imagine Turkey can advance, but to make that crystal clear, right at the outset, it is not an argument that comes even close to convince. My position is, and I cannot see much, if at all, serious disagreement being articulated among international lawyers so far, is that this operation is not only unlawful under international law, but it is a very serious violation of international law, amounting to what international lawyers call aggression, the most serious form of the use of force. And I'm grateful that we have the opportunity here to address these international legal issues, because following conversations about Syria, my increasing sentiment is that this conflict is no longer discussed in terms of international law, but just geopolitics. And that in itself is a frightening development if one believes in the value of an international rule-based order. So coming to this argument, indeed, that's one of the few things Turkey has respected in terms of international law, writing a letter to the Security Council. And in this letter, this passage forms part of it that you have mentioned, Ryan. The key requirement for the right of self-defense that Turkey invoked as its legal justification is the existence of an armed attack. Now, there is considerable controversy, dispute among international lawyers whether such an armed attack must have been carried out by another state. I will come to that. That has to do with your point about the US legal view in a minute. I will just assume at this moment in time, to the benefit of Turkey, that we can start an argument on, or with respect to self-defense on the basis that a non-state armed attack, so massive cross-border non-state violence, is enough to give us a trigger. But then read carefully what this sentence says. It says, without, by the way, any substantiation in facts, time, place. That's another question, to what extent we can take that at face value. But taking it at face value, facilitating the cross-border delivery of arms, so facilitation by a non-state agent of some kind of weapons cross-border to assist another non-state actor in another territory to conduct crimes, serious crimes, if the factual assertion is correct. Well, this type of activity is likely to constitute a crime. It may be prosecuted, but it does not even come close under any reasonable interpretation of the term, does not even come close to constitute an armed attack, which is the basic requirement for self-defense. And quite strikingly, Turkey's letter itself does not use that term. One would expect that Turkey has invested all possible intellectual energy in drafting the most convincing justification. And the key term, armed attack, does not even appear. If you read this letter closely, it is rather suggesting not so much that Turkey was responding to an ongoing armed attack, a non-state armed attack, but it was rather hinting in somewhat uncertain terms to the possibility of Turkey using preventive force, a kind of act of preventive self-defense. Here again, we enter a controversial area of international law, because there is a significant number of international scholars saying that the United Nations Charter does preclude any form of preventive use of force. Here again, taking the most, so to speak, beneficial interpretation, of what Turkey could bring forward. What one would have to insist on in case of an act of preventive self-defense is a substantiated case that in this case massive cross-border non-state violence was imminent. Imminent meaning about to occur. And there is nothing in this Turkish letter to substantiate that claim. So, to summarize this part of my answer to your question, the right of self-defense has been invoked by Turkey, but to my sense in a clearly abusive manner. This claim to self-defense has to be rejected. There is no other legal justification even being possibly reasonably be considered. And as this has been not a, so to speak, surgical airstrike of one day confined to a minimal portion of territory, but a massive military operation, even conducted with the declared aim to execute some kind of population exchange, this is certainly one of the most serious matters, and this is why I say it amounts to aggression. Now, the second part of your question, has not or have not the United States made similar claims? You will certainly hear in the course of this conversation that I'm not uncritical of the United States and certain international law positions they have recently taken. However, to the best of my awareness, the United States have, even in the past years, not gone so far to make a claim that would, so to speak, mirror the abusive claim that Turkey has made in this letter. However, there are two lines of arguments, international legal arguments, the United States have made in recent years. And with recent years, I mean going even back beyond Trump, not just blaming the Trump administration here. The first is putting into question the very, very limited scope that was, I think, universally agreed amongst international lawyers for any conceivable right of preventive self-defense. I'm now here referring to the 2002 National Security Doctrine of the United States that suggested, it was formulated to reinterpret the old standard, which goes back to 1837, the Caroline case, and give it basically an uncontrollable scope of taking action against any latent threat of rogue states and terrorist actors. So that has been a very dangerous avenue, and you can see here in this case Turkey building its case on a notion of imminence, which has little to do with any reasonable argument which is possible. So that's the one dangerous avenue the United States have opened. And the second one is when the United States built their case of having a right of self-defense against non-state armed attacks. This is an argument the United States have been making over several years, and I think in principle with tenable reasons. I'm not rejecting this argument as such, but they have given it an extremely wide application by using this dangerous language again, and that was in connection with Al-Qaeda still, against Al-Qaeda and associated forces, without any specification what those associated forces are, how close their relationship is with the actual adversary, Al-Qaeda at the time. And this loose framing of the legal argument has led to what I call a dangerous individualization of the right of self-defense. The right of self-defense in international law, for very good and compelling reasons, is confined to a defense of collective violent activity. And the more you individualize this argument, the less you make it controllable and the more you open it to abusive claims. That's not to say the United States have gone so far as Turkey did here, but it is to say that the United States have opened certain avenues which I would have preferred they had not.
So, John and Anne, if I can pick up off of Klaus saying one non-state actor assists another non-state actor, and ask if that's in part an accurate depiction. So in a sense, to kind of explore the dilemma, as I understand it, of U.S. foreign policy, which is this was the best local actor. There were some local actors that were just completely off limits, as Al-Qaeda and the like. But the Kurd forces, as part of the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, being the best local partner that the United States chose. But at the same time, the subset, the Kurd forces, the YPG, isn't it a plausible argument to be made on the part of Turkey? And that's the other part of the dilemma. U.S. NATO member ally says, you know, that they're just the Syrian wing of the PKK. That's all they are. It's kind of the same organization. They swear to the same leader. They follow the same overall objective that the PKK has. They share it. So can you kind of walk us through that, the two horns of that dilemma? Like, how do you, what the U.S. has been up to, but then doesn't Turkey in some sense have a legitimate claim when President Trump says that, and he says, hey, you know, maybe he goes a little bit too far by saying that their threat from the PKK and the YPG was greater than the ISIS threat. Maybe too far, but still, isn't there something there? Is there a truth in there to that being a part of the dilemma?
Want me to start
You
this
take it
time?
first.
Sure. So I guess the best way to look at this is, I think, a sort of succession of decisions that were made, and to try to give some sense of why each one was made the way it was. So starting again, I guess, where I began my last answer, which is the problem that's presented is ISIS in control of 1/3 of Iraqi and Syrian territory and actively plotting attacks on Western Europe, potentially on the United States, not to mention terrorizing people in those countries. So the U.S. decides at that point, our administration decides at that point, that this is our top priority for this part of the world. That actually, you know, whatever had been going on vis-a-vis Assad, which we haven't even really gotten into in this discussion, shows how far the debate has shifted. This is now sort of job one, and how are we going to address it? So that's the first decision. Prioritize this part of the conflict over anything else that's going on. Second is, how are we going to fight it? President Obama came to office knowing at least one really big thing about the world, which is that he did not like the invasion of Iraq. It's a big part of why he had won the Democratic primary in 2008, and a big part of what distinguished him not just from Hillary Clinton, but from John McCain in the general election. He had been an early opponent of that and thought it was wrong, very similar to some of the things that President Trump said when he was running. So the notion of a major U.S. military intervention to deal with this problem was probably like the last best option that he would have considered, and was open to almost anything short of that if possible. So we went looking for partners. We had, in the context of the Syria conflict, worked with a whole wide range of partners, from groups that were bordering on, verging toward, working with more extreme elements of the Syrian opposition, to groups like the Syrian Kurds, who had not really been engaged as much in the civil war up until that point. In the end, for pragmatic reasons above all others, that we believe that they would be effective fighters, we ended up choosing for this fight to partner with the Syrian Kurds, in part based on some very difficult, very frustrating experiences in support of other elements of the Syrian opposition, who, and some of this has been widely written about, took equipment that was provided to them by the United States and immediately turned it over to groups that were like affiliated with Al-Qaeda, this sort of thing. These are the kinds of experiences that we had had with some of the groups that, frankly, Turkey would have preferred us to work with, not their mortal enemies, the Syrian Kurds. So we went into this for practical reasons and with kind of eyes wide open about the fact that the Turks were going to hate it, and that eventually, somehow, this would have to be reconciled. We had long arguments, extended conversations with Turkey in the process of making this decision and going forward with it. You know, Turkey's role in the early part of the Syrian conflict, I think, is really complicated, but they were, let's just say, much more comfortable with certain more extreme elements of the Syrian opposition than we were, and much less comfortable with the Kurds than we were. So our interests are not totally aligned, even though they are a NATO ally of the United States. So we make this pragmatic decision, and then the conflict plays out as the conflict plays out. And I think in some ways, again, this is the most defensible piece of the whole policy story. It is far from perfect. There were way too many civilians who lost their lives in the fight against ISIS, which is impossible to defend. But the trajectory of the conflict is successful in military terms. ISIS is eventually, over time, defeated, and everybody knew that this bill would eventually have to be kind of brought whole with Turkey. My view of this was that there was potentially a way out of this, not a high probability of success, but potentially. And that was that the U.S. had kind of one card to play in this equation, which is our withdrawal. Turkey wanted the United States out of northeastern Syria because they didn't want us working with the Kurds. The Syrian government wanted the U.S. out of northeast Syria because they didn't want us working with, didn't want us occupying parts of their country or involved with a group that was in opposition to them. Once President Trump played that card, by announcing that the U.S. was going to withdraw from northeast Syria, the negotiators who were kind of withholding it and seeing what they could extract in terms of protections for that part of the country, maybe to avoid a Turkish incursion, all of a sudden had kind of the rug pulled out from under them. And at that point, all Turkey really had to do, and the Syrian government really had to do, was kind of wait the United States out, allow President Trump's kind of natural impulses, inclinations to eventually take hold, which they eventually did, even though the actual withdrawal has been a little less clear. And a year later, after he had first said he was going to execute that, he began to do that. So I think there was actually the potential for a way to do this without as much bloodshed as we've seen. Again, like, you can be skeptical of that. I'm skeptical of that. But it's a far better outcome and what we should have been aspiring to than the one that transpired.
I think I'll just chime in with some on-the-ground details that will give you a little bit of a vision of these contradictions. I mean, my team members from the New York Times who traveled to the areas where the SDF was operating, essentially all of them saw signs that the YPG was really the group in control, especially in the first years, that they had posters of Abdullah Öcalan, their leader and sort of cult-like figure, everywhere. There were some who were, nominally YPG SDF officers, but didn't really speak much Arabic. So they were maybe Turkish Kurds that were original members of the PKK. So there were all kinds of signs that the at least initially, calling it the SDF was something of a fiction, a fig leaf to mollify Turkey, and also to deal with the complications within Syria between Arab and Kurdish and other populations, because the whole area we're talking about is not entirely Kurdish. It's a patchwork. Now, as things developed, it became even more complex and nuanced, because those efforts, I think, did work to some extent to broaden out the base of the YPG. Even Arab residents who did not take kindly at first to the idea of a Kurdish-led force, and specifically a YPG force, because not all Kurds are affiliated with the YPG, and that's a terminology that really matters, that the shorthand that we use actually does obscure the realities many times. So eventually, people found that actually it wasn't that bad being under a force that at least was protecting them from the main aggressors in the region, even if there were quibbles about were there enough Arabs on the local councils, was the YPG really the final decision maker in everything, in all power issues. Now, there were, of course, exceptions to this. There were some abuses. There were Arabs that were displaced from their homes, and later there were Kurds that were displaced from their homes as things became even more complicated. But what we ended up having was, sort of as a byproduct of this fight against ISIS, the U.S. supporting what was really maybe the only, quasi-alternative to Assad, even though, ironically, the area had not been an initial center of the uprising. So then we were left with this ethical and moral and strategic dilemma of how long is the United States going to continue to support this enterprise, especially when it now has a questionable legal basis under the AUMF if we're not fighting ISIS anymore. And Russia was strongly interested in having the entire country reintegrated under the Assad government so that it could declare a win for sovereignty and for its partner and all of its priorities. One other card, as John was talking about, playing the card of our withdrawal, which was really wasted in this particular poker game. Even as recently as a year ago, former administration people were saying that really Trump should be honest with the SDF, and we should tell them that we're going to be leaving, and we should push them to make a deal with the Assad regime and Russia, where they will be integrated into the Syrian forces. It made more sense to let them try than to do it this way and pull the rug out from under them all of a sudden. But just to show how very difficult these policy dilemmas were, I personally don't believe that there was a deal to be made that would have really protected any of their interests. That Russia might have agreed to a deal that wouldn't later be reneged about keeping any of the governance or military structures of the SDF, of keeping Kurdish rights and all the things that people in that area might want when the regime comes back. There is no history in this conflict of the regime taking back any area and allowing any alternative structures to remain. To the contrary, anyone who participated in those structures tends to be punished, disappeared, conscripted, killed, tortured, because even those that actively engage in reconciliation processes with the regime, because the whole point is they want to come back and say we're the only ones in charge. So, where does that, coming back to your question, I think there isn't really much evidence that, as much as there, I'm pointing to some of the complications of the YPG and its affiliations and the ethnic balance. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that they were focused on doing anything inside Turkey. They were very much interested in keeping the project that they had in Syria, and I think that was certainly reinforced by the American partners. And in fairness, John and I have both, had this formative experience of our adult lives watching the Iraqi occupation and watching the series of failed attempts to train up a functional Iraqi armed force, and you can see the same thing in Afghanistan. The SDF, for all its warts, was successful and at a much lower cost in both American money and lives than any of these other proxy wars. So again, that doesn't mean that there was a policy or legal argument to indefinitely continue sustaining it, but it does make it a terrible waste to give it away for nothing.
Just one other quick thing in response to Ann. I agree, by the way, with everything that Ann just said. We've, in the past, sometimes disagreed on some elements of this, but I agree with all that. I think just to be fair to the Turks for a second in terms of reflecting what they would say, not that I agree with it, but what they would say, I think, is that these groups are 100% contiguous in effect, if not in formal membership, and that it is strictly not accurate to speak of kind of two separate non-state actors, but rather of one very sort of uniform, again, in their view, non-state actors. I think our view would be this is much more like concentric circles, the SDF being the kind of broadest, then the Kurds within the SDF, then the YPG Kurds within the community of Kurds, and then the PKK-affiliated YPG members within that. And that really only Turkey should be worried about that smallest group. That's the most charitable kind of opposition to the Turkish view. The truth is probably somewhere in between these representations, but the Turks would put this much differently. And then, to Ann's point about whether a deal was possible, I guess the only thing that gives me slightly more optimism about this particular part of Syria than other attempts to have fostered some degree of reconciliation in other parts of the country, which I fully agree have been disastrous for the people living there, these people had not really fought the regime in a meaningful way. So the degree of antipathy that, for example, the regime held toward other parts of the country where they had shed a lot of blood, poured a lot of resources, and that were sort of strategically more central to their ability to hold on to like their main quarters of power, I think there's a difference there in how the regime saw these parts of Syria. And at a point in the conflict where regime resources, armed forces, and money were depleted to such a large extent, I think it is possible, again, not probable, that they would have accepted a degree of autonomy, not anything resembling independence or full autonomy, but a degree of autonomy there that they would not have accepted remotely in other parts of the country. Again, that may well be wrong, but that's what gave me like slightly more confidence about it.
But one thing I have to say in response to that is it depends on which parts of the parts.
Right.
Because in Hasaka and Kamishli, the more Kurdish-dominated cities, yes, the regime had kept in Kamishli even an airport, and there really had been no direct clashes between Kurdish armed groups, the YPG as it existed before the US came in and created the SDF, and the regime. But the SDF-controlled area also included Raqqa,
Raqqa, they were never gonna be able to stay.
and parts of Deir ez-Zor, where they are now protesting every day. The Arab populations there are protesting every day. These are people that are very anti-ISIS because the Shaitat tribe was really massacred by ISIS, and they had come to an accommodation with the Kurdish-led SDF, and they are concerned that they are going to be thrown under the bus by their, sometime Kurdish partners, for the very reason that John said, that Assad might be slightly more willing to deal with Kurds, although I'm skeptical even of that. But certainly there are areas that were part of the original uprising and that supported Free Syrian Army groups at the beginning. And finally, it's such an irony when the debate over whether the groups are contiguous or they're concentric circles really does mirror the debate about Syrian armed opposition, and whether, how much proximity or get along relationships between them and extremists constitutes them basically being the same as extremists. And John and I promise not to sidetrack the discussion in that direction, but again, it shows you that you can see there's a mirror image between the U.S. arguments and the Turkish arguments, and even within the international law issues that Klaus brought up, where these nitty gritty epistemological arguments about what one group is and what another group is are really at the heart of this.
So one set of questions that I want to ask, flipping it first to Anne and John and then back to Klaus, is the fate of the Kurds under the Turkish operations and occupation, and the role of the United States in helping facilitate, greenlight the operation itself. And then to Klaus, the question would be, for the U.S., is that a question of legal complicity on the part of the United States for the Turkish operations, or does law run out and it's about moral complicity? So to start it, Anne and John, it's for the fate of the Kurds or other civilians who are now potentially in the hands of Turkish forces under occupation, is it fair to raise the term of ethnic cleansing as a risk here? What do you think the future holds for those people? Question one. And then the second question is, what do you understand to be the U.S. role in greenlighting this, or facilitating it, or in some ways even amplifying the effect by first having the SDF pull out their defensive forces and then greenlighting it? So what's the relationship between what the Trump administration has done and the Turkish operations?
Can I start with the first question? So on the first question, I think the main thing that's happened is what we started with, that an area that had sort of seen the end of a big round of fighting quite some time ago is suddenly plunged into just straight up war again. And this is affecting all the ethnic groups in those areas sort of equally, because they're suddenly, literally families didn't know where to go, what direction would be safe, where most of the places that would take in refugees are already at capacity, and aid groups had to leave, and it's just a complete chaos. Second, yes, I think Kurds have reason to worry about an ethnic cleansing, because Erdogan said so. He said that what they want to do is resettle some of the more than 3 million Syrian refugees that are in Turkey. Most of those people are not from this part of Syria. There's nothing there. It's small towns, not enough to support this kind of population unless they're going to be indefinitely dependent in camps. Although there are many Syrian Kurds in Turkey, most of the refugees in Turkey are Arabs. So he even made this. We can go into what Trump said about it later, but I'll skip it for now. But basically, they are talking more or less openly about replacing Kurds with Arabs in some of these areas. Let's not also forget that in some of the border areas that could be affected by this live Assyrians who have perhaps direct ancestors that were affected by the genocide of the last century. So there is a historical fear of Turkish aggression there that is not totally unfounded.
So I agree with all that. I guess I would just add, I would love to and look forward to seeing a transcript of the Trump Erdogan phone call. I think absent that, it's pretty hard to know what exactly was said, but there are pretty strong indications that at least the message that the Turks took from that call was that they could go ahead. They're not looking for a confrontation with American forces in northeast Syria, and I don't think they thought they were going to have one based on that phone call. You know, the whiplash from that to then the letter, I think sort of comical letter that was written to Erdogan the next day, like, you know, don't do this, call you later kind of thing, suggests that somebody then like ran into the Oval Office and said, like, do you realize what now might happen? And the decision was then made, oh, well, let's just send a letter like discouraging it. I mean, leaving aside the kind of quality of that policymaking process, that seems to be more or less what happened. I mean, I think Anne's point about the long-stated, long-standing Turkish desire, somewhat paradoxically, to quote-unquote Arabize the communities along its border, I think is very real. The UN has expressed concern about their attempts to kind of remake the ethnic balance of that part of Syria, and you know, some evidence that are now, even based on this meeting in Sochi between Vladimir Putin and Erdogan, where they, you know, literally they were photographed with maps on the table, kind of dividing up bits and pieces of Syria, suggests that that's effectively what Turkey is trying to now execute. You know, the U.S. has said, Jim Jeffrey, the top kind of American diplomat focused on this problem, has said there's evidence of war crimes. I think we've all probably seen reports of the videos that have circulated, kind of demonstrating atrocities. You know, whether you call it ethnic cleansing or something else, like there are a lot of horrible things going on, and that seems quite clear. So I think their concerns are well founded.
Just to try to set the factual predicate a little bit more for Klaus. So within 4 or 5 days after the Trump-Erdogan phone call, the European members of the Security Council tried to pass a resolution condemning the Turkish operations, and the United States and Russia opposed it. Some foreign media picked it up as Russia and the United States vetoed it, which they didn't veto it, but it still gives this impression. Then there are the sanctions, so that I think also somebody got to Trump and said, well, we're going to threaten these sanctions on Turkey for the operation that he seemed to have green-lighted. And then more recently, the president said, well, they've now promised the ceasefire, so we're going to lift the sanctions. So these are just other kind of data points along the way that seem to indicate more of an affirmative role by the United States in facilitating the actions. So is that right, just to kind of...
Well, I mean, I'd love to hear
Right.
also the extent to which, like, to what extent is the U.S. the arbiter of whether the Turks are allowed to do this or not? To me, that just seems to be almost like a false premise to the entire, not your question is false, but if that's how the Turks are taking kind of the legitimacy and legality of their action based on a phone call from kind of the world's referee, President Trump, that does not strike me as consistent with how these decisions are made under international law.
Perhaps you mentioned the term ethical cleansing, perhaps to mention the name which to me is the most accurate ones in terms of international legal analysis, it would be forcible displacement. Forcible displacement of populations within a territory. If it's cross-border, it's deportation. If it's within a territory, it's forcible deportation. And just to set the record straight, this is not just a violation of international law, it is a crime under international law. As I would like to add, aggression is a crime under international law, engaging the individual criminal responsibility of those leaders responsible for this action. So that's the first point. The second point now, your question on the attitude taken by the United States, and of course factually I'm much less qualified to comment than my two co-panelists. The basic principle is if there is unlawful action by another state, as I maintain has been and is the case here with Turkey, under the applicable customary international law, no other state is in a position to aid or assist that state. Anything that would amount to aiding and assisting, which is probably some kind of physical act, not just political support, but it's probably more than this, any state assisting or aiding would itself be in violation of international law. And there is more, and this is why the distinction between an unlawful act and a serious violation of international law, amounting to the level of aggression, may be legally important here. Once a violation of international law is so serious that it amounts to aggression, the legal position of third states is no longer that they simply have to refrain from aiding or assisting. They are also, and that has been acknowledged by the International Law Commission, the United Nations International Law Commission, they are under a duty to contribute by legal means available to end this violation. So they are required to take positive action. So when you translate this to recent US steps, I do not think, at least I would be very, very hesitant to say that there was any international legal requirement under the circumstances for the United States to maintain their presence in the region. Whether the United States are still entitled to be there, that's perhaps a question we can come back to in a minute. But I don't think that international law requires the United States to stay there, and by withdrawing that they have somehow, by withdrawing, assisted and aided. I wouldn't go that far. But if you take the point, or if you take the starting point that we are in the area of aggression, so that third states have to do what they can do to contribute to ending the violation, this becomes an interesting point to what happened at the Security Council. Because whatever you think of the political power of a Security Council resolution, I think we have not come that far that we just consider it as a scrap of paper. But this is a legal tool available to states to react to a very serious violation of international law. And if a draft resolution is there and put to a vote, then the question arises. It's a difficult question. I'm not saying there is a clear international legal agreement on it, but at least a very serious question arises whether then states can still, for political, strategic reasons, say, we veto this resolution. If this would be, under the circumstances, one of the most significant steps to signify to a state that violates international law that the international community does not accept it. So, and to your question, who is, so to speak, the arbiter? Certainly not one individual state, certainly not the United States, as little as Germany and others, but we have come to agree that the Security Council of the United Nations, for better or worse, is that organ that represents the international community and vested with the primary responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. So it is basically there, in the absence of an international court, where the debate must take place. And I think doing the utmost for the Council would be within the spirit of trying to end a violation. And then to veto such a step at least gives rise to questions.
So just to first clarify the question that I did ask, and there's other points to put on the table, the data points of U.S. complicity or whatever, is not to suggest that that would ever be a legal green light or legally justify the Turkish operation. It's to actually suggest that the Turkish operation is illegal, potentially a crime of aggression, and then is the United States also engaging in illegal conduct by facilitating it? That's just to clarify that part of it. So coming then off of Klaus's last point, what, especially John, would you think of, and do you think of, as in the policy toolkit if you in fact had an administration that wanted to stop the ongoing Turkish operations? And does that policy toolkit include something as extreme as what Secretary Esper actually said on Sunday morning shows, that he had said to his Turkish counterparts that their status in NATO was potentially under threat? Or is that actually playing into other powers' hands like Russia to actually do something that would be that disruptive to NATO?
So, as with all policy decisions, I think the question has to be slightly different from what are all the tools available to produce this outcome? Because obviously the United States could do quite a lot of things to stop the Turkish offensive if it were the absolute top priority globally or even in the U.S.-Turkey relationship to do so. The question is kind of compared to what and producing what other outcomes that are not potentially consistent with U.S. interests. That's very much, by the way, the same mindset that goes into a decision like partnering with the SDF and the Syrian Kurds in the first place. You take the benefits of doing something like that, the practical benefits, given kind of the objective of defeating ISIS, you take the obvious negative repercussions in the U.S.-Turkey relationship, and you make a decision kind of knowing that the ledger is going to be balanced in one way or the other and picking a side. That's sort of very similar, I think, in some ways to the mindset that you would have to take to a question like this. And because of that, I think you would rule out immediately things like the U.S. intervening militarily to stop the Turkish offensive, whether or not it's been in green lit. You would not, and whatever obligations the U.S. has under international law, I find that analysis interesting but highly impractical from the perspective of somebody who's been involved in policymaking, because there's been no international legal determination of any kind of precedential value that this was an act of aggression. People can have the opinion that it is. I'm sure the Trump administration could conjure up opinions from the State Department Legal Advisor's Office that it isn't. And until that question has actually been adjudicated in some way, it's hard to see that as being kind of binding on a country in terms of its vote in the Security Council, again, to me, as a fake lawyer who's a member of the bar but never actually practiced. So speaking more pragmatically. But in terms of what the U.S. could actually do, I think taking Turkey out of NATO would be a big deal. It would be a big deal for NATO, because a step like that has never been taken against a NATO member. And even before, by the way, this most recent issue with Turkey, there has been a lot of discussion in NATO circles and observer circles of NATO about the membership and about the problematic nature of certain members, including Turkey, but on totally different grounds. NATO is ostensibly a community, that not just a security alliance, but a sort of community on some level of values, including democratic values. And there are countries like Turkey, like Hungary, like Poland, that are both members and experiencing a high degree of democratic backsliding. And so some people have kind of posited that there should be consequences within NATO to that. Again, I think strategically, kind of summarily tossing Turkey out of NATO, and even if that were possible, could have as many negative repercussions as positive. There's already this kind of ongoing flirtation going on between President Erdogan and President Putin. The world is increasingly being kind of balkanized into a sort of more authoritarian, closed society sphere. I'm not sure where we fall exactly anymore on this question, but a more kind of democratic-leaning, open society sphere, and then countries that are essentially swing voters in the middle. Turkey, I think 10 or 12 years ago, I would have felt comfortable with saying much more closely aligned with the open democratic societies, and today either a swing voter or much more in line with authoritarians, and we should be contesting those swing votes in the international system, and throwing them out of NATO, I think, would be a pretty big push in the other direction. I'll tell you one thing that I would think about doing, though, at this point, which is that there are, according to reports, and I'm not speaking about classified information here because I actually don't know the answer to this, some number of American nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, dozens probably. You could send a pretty significant signal that would have a pretty limited strategic effect, in my view, by putting into question whether those nuclear weapons should remain where they are. That might be the kind of message I would think about sending.
John, perhaps one immediate response. I'm not surprised that you say an international legal analysis is impractical or impracticable. This is what international lawyers often hear. But think this through, that you say international law, even when it comes to one of the fundamental legal rules, and also the US administration would agree that what is at stake here is a cornerstone of the international legal order. Think what it means, if we think that through, that it's too impractical to even raise the issue before the Security Council where it belongs. This would raise questions of consistency. Many states, including the United States have, and I think fortunately, used, and I don't say abused, used international law to criticize the Russian annexation of Crimea. Here again, you don't have an international court. We have not waited to condemn this flagrant violation of a cornerstone of the international legal order until a court has pronounced itself. This question has been debated before the Security Council, as it always is being debated in serious international crisis without an authoritative pronouncement of an international criminal court. This is how it works in the international legal order. But how can you respond to a Russian argument that, in introverted commas, we, the West, use international law to criticize Russia's annexation of Crimea as internationally unlawful, impose sanctions, withhold the recognition? This is an entire policy not just based, and fortunately, not just based on strategic considerations, but in our belief that this cornerstone of the international legal order must be upheld. And then to be essentially silenced because our interests, and I recognize those interests, are pointing in a different direction here. International law is in that sense a very fragile instrument. It has a lot to do with legitimacy, and legitimacy requires consistent behavior. And there is a limit, I believe, a limit beyond which you can strain and stretch this legal edifice before you call it into question in its entirety. And this, I think, this is what I would urge you. I understand your, so to speak, your discomfort with a legal analysis, but I urge you also to take into consideration what is at stake, and that this perhaps should also form part of a strategic long-term analysis.
So I guess just briefly, I take those points. I would respond to that by saying, and I, by the way, come from an administration in which, if anything, we were criticized for over-lawyering policy decisions, having too many people who came from a legal background at every level of decision-making, from the president to the vice president to two secretaries of state to the national security advisor, deputy national security advisors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, whatever other failings we had, lack of sufficient legal knowledge in the room when policy decisions were made, or lack of concern for legal issues was not our primary problem. This administration may be different. I guess what I would say is if you are concerned about the ongoing viability and efficacy of international law, I think my practical concern about trying to impose a voting obligation in the Security Council based on a contested, at this point, legal opinion is much more likely to lead to international law being explicitly discounted, discredited, ignored, even by its champions, and I still consider the United States to be one of those within the international system, rather than just deciding not to put countries in that position in the first place. Because there will always be tension, as you rightly described, I think, between countries' kind of national geopolitical strategic calculus and their desire to uphold these principles. But I think the people who really want to protect and defend international law need to pick their battles in that context, and this is not the one that I would choose.
Great. So we have time for questions from the audience. Oh, yeah. Are there microphones? Great. Microphones will be passed around.
Thank you. I have two questions. First of all, is what we have just seen in Syria a strategic defeat for the United States? And secondly, you know, we're in an unusual time where foreign policy is not necessarily being conducted along the lines of what perhaps people were taught in a traditional IR class. And some argue, of course, that Trump, in declaring triumph in Syria, he says it's a win-win-win. One could crassly employ the questions of his material interests with Russia, with Turkey, etc., in seeing perhaps it's a transactional decision that he did for his own self-interest, as we see him do all over the world. How do you see those two factors or issues or problems in this whole situation?
I think when we look at this question of strategic defeat, there are many different lenses to look at it through, and I'll just name a few, and I'm sure the other panelists have things to say about it. There was already a competition, if you like, between the US and Russia about who is the more reliable partner, and clearly this reinforced an idea that Russia chooses its battles, commits to them, and shows up with the resources needed to get the job done. Whether you agree with their goals and their tactics or not is a whole other story. But certainly in the Syria arena, we've seen Russia be a much more effective and reliable partner than the US. This also allowed Russia and to another extent Iran, to a lesser extent Iran, to further benefit from the vacuum left by the United States. I think there's also a broader long-term strategic issue when it comes to Syria, which is that the largest, you could say, humanitarian, ethical, political, moral catastrophe of the century so far has unfolded really without a coherent American response. And in fact, people from all different sides have different slices of blame that they'd like to pin on America, but in the long-term public diplomacy sense, there's a real question about the strategic impact.
I think the symbolism of this is horrendous for the United States, and I agree with Anne's analysis. Sort of, kind of the basic kind of horse race in the Middle East analysis of like Russia, Iran up, U.S. down, is certainly what this all looks like. To me, the much more consequential potential strategic effect, again, which is mostly symbolic until it's not, is the future willingness of partners of the United States to actually work with us, given what we've just shown is our willingness to stand by them in the aftermath of us getting what we wanted out of that relationship. So I think all that is real. On the other hand, though, I mean, this is not a part of the world, or at least not a part of the world that is central to American interests, in my view, Syria in particular. This is not a long-standing U.S. partner that was lost to Russia or Iran. We sort of talk about it that way sometimes because we've been somewhat invested there. To me, it's not a major economic partner of the United States. It's not a major security threat to the United States other than the terrorist problem within its borders. The country itself, as horrific as it is in just about every way, does not pose a security threat to the United States. We have two interests there, primarily, if you're just being cold and calculating about it. ISIS and kind of the continued viability and kind of humanitarian well-being of Syrian partners of us. Compare those interests to what the cost of an ongoing engagement along the lines that some in the policy community have argued for many years and continue to argue for. And I think the question of what sort of investment those interests justify is a really close call. And compared to, for example, losing Turkey as a NATO ally or as a country with a Western and democratic orientation over the long period of time, I mean, that strikes me, again, if you're just thinking in strategic terms, as a much more consequential world event than the future of a narrow slice of a country that the United States really never had a meaningful claim on in the first place. The humanitarian questions are hugely consequential, separate, and deserving of their own consideration. But if you're only talking about the strategic calculus at this point, now that the refugee flows have already gone into Europe and kind of destabilized the continent, take yourself back 5, 6, 7 years, I think the strategic questions are very different. At this point, I think much of what can be accomplished in Syria by the United States has been lost.
Hello there. Gabriel Armas Cardona, human rights lawyer based at the University of Leipzig in Germany. My question is depressingly almost passé, which is, what are the ramifications of these war crimes on international humanitarian law? I mean, for a long time, we've had evidence of Russia and Syria purposely bombing hospitals for years, but they were, the quote-unquote bad guys from the Western perspective, and now we have allegations of Turkey committing war crimes, including ethnic cleansing as just one of others. Are we basically entering a new normal where, this type of brutality should be expected, or what?
Yes, I share your sentiment of depression in view of the allegations you have referred to, even though I'm not yet, with respect to this specific military operation we have talked about, in a position to comment too much on the facts regarding war crimes allegations. My argument here was basically, so to speak, on the decision that led to all this violence, but with the usual consequences. It is not exceptional that once you have launched a major military operation, then you have all these consequential war crimes allegations. Well, I don't think, to counter at least a little bit your depressive sentiment, I do not see that we are somehow expecting a new legal norm to arrive that condones or incorporates a heightened level of violence. However, what is important if we wish to maintain international legal standards, including those on war crimes, non-forcible displacement, and so forth, is to somehow, modest as it may be, to somehow react to their occurrence. We have a panoply of international instruments nowadays, and fortunately this panoply has been increased. The spectrum has been increased. We have a number of international courts, and you will see, I think it's quite likely that there will be cases, for example, before the European Court of Human Rights regarding these allegations. So it is not the case that the international infrastructure, legal infrastructure, is not there, but it will be crucial to use it. And this is why I, a minute ago, made this point about being overly silent, even though there are terrible political and strategic dilemmas that I fully acknowledge. Being overly silent is a problem. And especially in a case, and here I profoundly disagree with John, especially in a case where the law is clear. We are not talking here about a contentious case of the use of force, if viewed in international legal standards. I have very recently published with Ryan a very long article acknowledging to what extent international law is unfortunately uncertain. I'm not naive and ignoring that there are gray areas in the law. I think it requires our honesty to accept this. But there are still instances of the use of force where all reasonable international lawyers can agree that the law has been violated. And in such a case, in particular, there is not, I think, an excuse to remain silent, but at least one has to signal the negative opinion of the international community by those means, modest as they may be, that are at your disposition.
So time for, I think, one question left.
Thanks. Caitlin Hu from CNN. Anne, I'd like to hear from you in the context of talking about what the policy instruments are and what the legal mechanisms are for the various actors that are active in the region. What I wonder if you could characterize the feeling on the ground or from the Syrian Kurds about how effective any of these structures are in actually preventing the repercussions of Turkish aggression or other, supposedly illegal per international law actions. Is there a confidence that there is protection for them or that they have recourse?
Well, no, I think not only the Syrian Kurds, but people from pretty much every group in Syria, and this is why I referred to this in the question about strategic defeat. Syrians of every stripe have found that the promises of the international community, whether political, I think they've given up a long time ago on the idea that anything resembling international law would be enforced by anyone, which of course is not new. It is actually not new. I was going to say in response to the previous question for U.S. allies to engage in war crimes. That is not new. What I think we can say has changed, maybe going back to 9/11 and the U.S.'s various responses to 9/11 and its, shall we say, innovative approach to international law, is that the U.S. as an entity that tried to speak out for human rights and a rules-based international order, even with the certain, as you said, there's a limit to how inconsistent one can be, but within some limits, being inconsistent at times, but also trying to be a beacon for those types of ideals. I think we've seen a retreat from that, that, as we, I guess let's tell the story this way. John said that the strategic considerations were quite different 4 or 5 years ago. I think more specifically 6 years ago, the strategic conditions were quite different into 2013 when there was a decision not to enforce the red line. And what we've seen since then is, in fact, a normalization of the use of chemical weapons, of bombing hospitals, and increasingly not even bothering to condemn. As you said, not saying a minimum, not taking, of course there are actions taken, but we have seen the dismissal of these things as something that is not part of our strategic concerns. But there is a strategic value in the idea that there are ideals that people around the world aspire to and seek to promote, and that American words really matter. And when America, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, spoke out in support of these movements, perhaps mistakenly and naively, people believed that that meant there would be some kind of support backing up those statements, even if it was more political support, even if they were not expecting some kind of Iraq-style full-on invasion. I think I could end with the story of Mazen Darwish, who he's a lawyer who's now based in Berlin, and he's also a survivor of the Syrian torture prisons. And he tells a story about how he told a European parliamentarian back in maybe 2013 that if the world continued to see Syria as an isolated, containable human rights disaster, then eventually Europe would face some of these dangers itself at home, that it would see an increase in authoritarianism and human rights abuses in the West. He said this won't stay in Syria. And he said that he later got a call, and the parliamentary group that he was speaking to basically laughed at him and said that's ridiculous. A few years later, he got a call from them, from one of the people who had been at that speech, saying, you were absolutely right, because what did happen in the interim was that Syria was completely decimated. People were, we know all the statistics, driven out of the country, half the country displaced, 6 million refugees outside the country, and many of them going to Europe, helping to fuel a rise in xenophobia, racism, right-wing extremism that has in fact led to more authoritarian policies in both Europe and I think arguably in the United States, and has undermined the Western alliances. So I'll leave it there.
Can I just quickly on picking up where Anne left off? I don't think this is what you meant to imply, and I'm not sure people took it this way, but just because I think it's important for people to understand what the United States did and did not do in response to the Arab Spring, and specifically in Syria, I would not want people to be left with the impression, based on your own understanding, based on Ann's comments, anything that was said here today, that the United States somehow did not intervene in Syria on behalf of the people who were fighting against Bashar al-Assad.
And I will stipulate to that. That is correct. They did.
And at some point, sort of there will be a fuller accounting of what that assistance entailed, and it won't be here, and it won't be by me. And I think it will really shock people, the extent of it, the scope, the cost. And the reality is, could more have been done? Yes. Was the strategic objective that that assistance was meant to achieve successful? Definitely not. Is there a strong case to be made that maybe it even made things worse or extended the conflict in certain ways? Yes, there is. And so I feel like, with the humility of somebody, by the way, who worked on this stuff for 4 or 5 years and is not purporting to have succeeded, my main lesson from my experience in Iraq, from working on this stuff in Syria, is that we should have a higher, not a lower threshold for these sorts of interventions. And the reason why Syria was so hard, unlike Iraq, which is a much more clear-cut case, in my view, is that the status quo in Iraq was relatively stable, as terrible as Saddam Hussein was, relatively non-threatening to the United States, menacing to the Iraqi people, but not with the death and destruction and humanitarian catastrophe on the scale that you saw in Syria. The harder thing is the status quo on Syria was itself so terrible. So, the main argument against these interventions is you don't want to make things worse. It is hard in the Syria context to see how you could have meaningfully made things worse, given how terrible they were. But these are the kinds of questions that we wrestle with.
And I should add that I'm responding to the idea of speaking out in legal terms and the whole spectrum of responses, not a military response per se, but the idea of trying to lay down markers and to say that there are things that the world needs to take notice of and take a stand on.
So we're unfortunately out of time with such an incredible conversation. I do want to maybe then touch on that just as the last note of what Ann said, and somewhat in some ways unify the panel on another dimension, which is that Germany has actually exercised its criminal prosecutorial authority to go after incumbent officials inside the Syrian government, including a high-ranking military officer, not a former officer, but a current officer, which is remarkable in international law and policy, using universal jurisdiction, which is a statute that says even if there's no nexus or connection to Germany, the crime is so atrocious that they're permitted to do so. And then just to touch one piece of it that's remarkable is that then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo makes a statement endorsing the German position to extradite this individual on the basis of universal jurisdiction for suspected crimes of the Assad regime. So there are those developments. I'm not sure if Pompeo fully understood how significant that might be for the United States also supporting other initiatives like that, but there's something, it's a tiny glimmer of hope, but it's along that spectrum that's not military force, but it's something else. So please join me in thanking just such an extreme.